A black soldier had just returned home from deployment. Exhausted but relieved. Ready to embrace the simple comfort of home after months overseas. But the moment he stepped into the airport, everything took a turn he never expected. A security officer, one who should have been ensuring the safety of all passengers, zeroed in on him. At first, it seemed like a simple misunderstanding. But then, it became clear. This was no mistake. The officer targeted him without reason, humiliated him in front of travelers, treating him as if he were a threat instead of a man who had risked his life for his country. People watched, some in stunned silence, others too afraid, or too unwilling, to step in. But just 7 minutes later, everything flipped. The officer was fired on the spot. And what happened next? It was something no one saw coming. What started as an act of blatant injustice quickly turned into something much bigger. A moment that sent shockwaves beyond the airport, sparking conversations, forcing a reckoning that could no longer be ignored. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Because this is about more than one man. This is about who we choose to be. Isaiah Carter had known weariness before. He had carried it across foreign battlefields, through the wet stink of jungles and the dry, blistering heat of base camps. He had felt it in the long silences between explosions, in the aching space left by men who should have been beside him but were now buried in places he would never visit again. But this was a different kind of tiredness. This was the exhaustion that set in when a man realized he was stepping off one battlefield and into another. Different only in its weapons and tactics. This was the weight that came from understanding that no matter how many years he had given, how much blood he had seen spilled, his own and others, he was still walking into a world that questioned whether he had the right to sit down. The airport was a strange sort of in-between place. A collection of faces passing each other with the kind of indifference that only strangers can afford. But Isaiah had learned, long ago, that not all strangers saw him as neutral. He moved with quiet purpose through the terminal, his uniform still fitting his frame as if war had sculpted it onto him. The fabric was worn, softened by time, its colors dulled but its meaning unmistakable. A few people noticed him, nodding briefly in the way civilians did when they weren't sure if they should say something. A man in a business suit gave him a polite, distant smile. A middle-aged woman clutched the strap of her purse a little tighter as she passed him. Some habits never changed. Isaiah ignored it. He had trained himself to. The ticket agent glanced at him as he handed over his boarding pass. The pause was brief, but it was there, just a fraction of a second too long before she recovered and said, "First-class boarding will begin shortly." That pause. He had seen it before. It was the kind of hesitation that lived in a man's bones. That was felt more than seen. He wondered, as he often did, whether it was suspicion or simple surprise. Whether she had been trained to expect someone else in his place. As he stepped onto the plane, the contrast was immediate. The hush of first class. The polished stillness of privilege. The air itself seemed softer, conditioned for those who moved through the world without having to brace for impact. Isaiah found his seat, 2A, and settled in, placing his bag carefully by his feet. He exhaled slowly, allowing himself a rare moment of ease. And then, just as his shoulders had begun to relax, a shadow fell over him. A woman stood there, her posture stiff, her expression carefully arranged. Not outright hostile. No, hostility would have been too obvious. It was something smaller, sharper, a smile that was not a smile. A voice too measured, as if she had rehearsed it. "Excuse me," she said, "I believe you're in the wrong seat." Isaiah looked at her, then at his ticket. He had known this moment was coming. He had felt it the moment he stepped on the plane. The moment her eyes flicked toward him and then away. As if she had already decided something about him before he even sat down. "This is my seat," he said evenly. He held up the ticket. The proof printed in black and white. She glanced at it, and for a moment, something flickered in her face. Something uncertain, something almost reluctant. But then the mask returned. "There must be a mistake," she insisted. "Are you sure you meant to book first class?" Isaiah's jaw tightened. He could hear it beneath her words. Beneath the veneer of forced politeness. Are you sure you belong here? It was not a question she would have asked the man sitting across the aisle. Flipping through the Wall Street Journal. It was not a question she would have asked if his uniform had come with a different skin. The moment stretched, thick with expectation. The tension that lived in rooms where a decision was about to be made. Where someone would either choose to let a man exist, or decide to make him prove his right to do so. Isaiah could feel the eyes of the other passengers now. Pretending not to listen but listening all the same. He had spent years learning how to read a room. How to sense the temperature of a moment before it boiled over. He did not move. The woman's lips pressed together. The first hint of frustration breaking through her poise. And then, with a sigh, she turned toward the flight attendant. "Excuse me," she said again, louder this time. "I think there's been an error with my seat." Isaiah's fingers curled slightly against the armrest. The battle was beginning. The moment the woman turned to the flight attendant, Isaiah Carter knew exactly where this was going. He had been here before. Not on a plane, not in first class, but in moments just like this. The setting changed, the faces changed, but the script was always the same. The words didn't have to be spoken outright. They hovered in the air, shaping themselves into something unseen but deeply felt. "This is not where you belong. This is not what I expected." The flight attendant, a woman in her mid-40s with the kind of practiced politeness that had been worn thin over time, approached with measured steps. She looked from the woman to Isaiah, then back again. She hesitated. It was not a hesitation of uncertainty. It was the hesitation of someone calculating how much trouble this would be. Who would be easier to displace? Who would be easier to appease? "Is there a problem here?" the flight attendant asked. Her voice clipped, controlled. The woman, Mrs. Whitmore, as her boarding pass identified her, let out a carefully restrained sigh, tilting her head just slightly, as if she were explaining something obvious to a child. "I believe there's been an error," she said, her tone a shade too light, too patient. The way people spoke when they wanted to appear reasonable while making something unreasonable sound normal. Isaiah watched as Mrs. Whitmore placed her hand on her chest. A small, subtle performance of discomfort, not outright distress, but enough to signal that she was the one being inconvenienced. The flight attendant turned to Isaiah, her expression neutral, but the weight of her expectation was clear. "Sir, may I see your ticket?" Isaiah knew what was happening. He handed her the ticket without a word. She studied it, as if the seat assignment might change under closer inspection, as if the ink might somehow betray him. Finally, she forced a smile, but it was tight, lacking warmth. "It does appear that this is your assigned seat," she said, as if she, too, had expected a different outcome. Mrs. Whitmore's face hardened, but she wasn't done yet. "Well," she said, her voice sharper now, "perhaps there's another seat available in coach? I'd be happy to swap if it means avoiding an unpleasant situation." The room, the air, the very weight of the moment shifted. She had made the offer sound gracious, as if she were the one extending kindness, as if he were the problem. And this, Isaiah knew, was the real war, not the kind with bullets and trenches, but the war that was fought in rooms where people made decisions about who got to be comfortable, who got to belong. The flight attendant hesitated again. She was considering it, the possibility of making it all go away. A simple request, wasn't it? Move the soldier, the black soldier, just a few rows back, just a little to the side. What harm could it do? Isaiah had seen this before. In diners that didn't say, "whites only," but made sure he understood anyway. In job interviews where they smiled too quickly and shook his hand too fast. Already moving on before he sat down. In the way people shifted in elevators. In the way clerks watched him when he walked into stores. It was always small, subtle, carefully worded, neatly packaged, but the meaning was always clear. He took a slow breath, measured his words carefully. "No," he said finally. "I'll stay where I'm seated." Mrs. Whitmore's lips pursed. "I don't see why you have to be difficult about this." Isaiah let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "Difficult," he repeated. "That's an interesting word." Her eyes narrowed. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. This was the moment. The decision point. Isaiah saw it in the way the flight attendant glanced toward the front of the plane, calculating whether this was worth escalating. He saw it in the way Mrs. Whitmore looked at her, waiting, expecting to be agreed with. Isaiah had fought for this country. He had bled for it. He had watched men who looked like him, and men who didn't, die in places whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce. And yet here he was, back on familiar ground. The fight was always the same. The difference was whether he was willing to make them say it outright. He turned, slow and deliberate, to the flight attendant. Make her say it. Make her explain it. Make her justify it. Are you asking me to move? He asked. His voice steady. The flight attendant flushed slightly. Number, sir. Of course not. Your seat is your seat, she said, but it was clear she had wanted a different solution. Mrs. Whitmore's jaw tightened. Well, she huffed, gathering her purse. I just hope this doesn't make the flight uncomfortable for everyone. And with that, she turned, marching back to her assigned seat with all the dignity of someone who believed they had been wronged. The flight attendant hesitated once more, looking at Isaiah as if she wanted to say something. An apology, a warning, or perhaps just a way to distance herself from the moment. But Isaiah didn't give her the chance. He leaned back in his seat, exhaled slowly, and waited for the rest of the war to unfold. The woman's indignation did not settle. It did not dissipate. It thickened, clinging to the air like humidity before a storm. Isaiah could feel it pressing against the back of his neck as he sat there, motionless, staring straight ahead. But the battle was not over. No, it had only retreated to the margins, lurking between the folds of hushed whispers and stolen glances. From behind him, Mrs. Whitmore sighed dramatically, her voice pitched just loud enough to be heard. Well, I suppose things aren't what they used to be. A pause, a deliberate one. Isaiah said nothing. Then another voice, male, older, perhaps her husband, or simply a fellow traveler who saw himself reflected in her frustration. They're letting just about anybody up here these days. A murmur of agreement, soft but sharp. Isaiah knew this game. He had seen it played out before. Across counters in diners, on sidewalks in neighborhoods where people like him were told they were better off elsewhere. They wouldn't say it outright. No, that wasn't how it worked anymore. No one needed to stand up and demand that he be removed. No one needed to curse him, or spit, or call him what they might have called him 20 years ago in another part of the country. They could do it like this instead, slowly tightening the noose of disapproval, making him feel unwelcome without ever once admitting that they were the ones who didn't belong. Isaiah exhaled through his nose. He had survived worse. And yet, there was something about this fight, this constant, slow battle to simply exist in spaces where he was not expected. That gnawed at him. This wasn't war, but it wasn't peaceful either. The flight attendant returned, passing through the aisle, eyes flicking toward him as she moved, checking, waiting. He could feel the question in her gaze. Was he going to make this a problem? Because that's how it worked, wasn't it? The person being challenged, the person being tested, the person being diminished, was always the one expected to smooth things over. And yet, Isaiah did nothing. He did not rise, did not turn, did not engage. But he knew, without a doubt, that the moment was not finished with him. 20 minutes into the flight, it escalated. A second flight attendant, younger than the first, approached him. Sir, she said, a practiced, cautious smile on her lips. We've received a request regarding your seat. Isaiah turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. A request, he repeated. She nodded. Yes. A passenger has expressed some concern. Isaiah almost smiled. Almost. Concern. That was a good word. Flexible, open-ended. It suggested nothing and everything at the same time. He had heard it before. Concern was why police officers stopped him in neighborhoods where he lived. Concern was why security guards watched him more closely in department stores. Concern was how people justified keeping men like him on the edges of spaces they had always assumed belonged only to them. Isaiah leaned back in his seat, adjusting his posture, letting his frame expand rather than shrink. What kind of concern? He asked. His voice level, The young flight attendant hesitated, shifting from one foot to the other. She was nervous now. Good. Well, she said, her voice lowering as if to keep the conversation civil, as if to keep it from becoming something else. Something more honest. The passenger behind you is feeling uncomfortable. Isaiah let the words settle between them. Uncomfortable. He turned, finally, letting his eyes meet Mrs. Whitmore's. She did not look away. She had expected him to shrink, to absorb the discomfort as his own, to smooth the moment over with an apology that had never been owed to her in the first place. Instead, he smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that held nothing of warmth, but everything of understanding. Then he turned back to the flight attendant. Well, he said, voice steady, that's unfortunate. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. She had come expecting a resolution, not resistance. Sir, perhaps if, quote. Isaiah raised a hand, cutting her off. No, he said, firm but calm. I paid for this seat. I was assigned this seat. And unless there's a policy I don't know about, I will be staying in this seat. The young flight attendant faltered. And for the first time since he boarded the plane, Isaiah saw the game shift. Because now, they had to decide how far they were willing to go. Would they make a scene? Would they push harder? Would they risk the other passengers watching? The flight attendant glanced toward the front of the cabin, where the first attendant stood watching, lips pressed together. Then she turned back, swallowing. Of course, she said finally, her voice thinner now. Enjoy your flight. She walked away, and behind him, Mrs. Whitmore let out another sigh. But this time, it was different, because she had lost. Isaiah settled back in his seat, but he did not relax. Because the war was never just one battle, and the plane still had hours to go. Isaiah Carter did not expect peace. Not here, not now. He had won his seat. But victory did not mean comfort. No, comfort was not a thing men like him were afforded in spaces like this. He could feel the shift in the air, the subtle change in the way people moved around him now. It was not dramatic. It never was. That was the thing about this kind of war. It wasn't fought with fists or shouts. It was fought with silence. With the calculated placement of a glance. With the turning of a shoulder at just the right moment. It was isolation. A quiet, deliberate thing. The moment the flight attendant walked away, he was alone. No one looked at him. No one acknowledged him. It was as if, in refusing to move, he had placed himself in a separate, untouchable space. A few rows ahead, a businessman shifted in his seat, opening his newspaper as if suddenly engrossed in something that wasn't happening a few feet away. The woman across the aisle, who had smiled at him earlier in the terminal, now pretended to be absorbed in her tablet. And behind him, Mrs. Whitmore and her kind were regrouping. Their whispers floated forward, little threads of conversation meant to be overheard, but not acknowledged. Entitled These Days. Never would have happened before. This country's changed, and not for the better. Isaiah didn't turn. He didn't need to. He had learned, long ago, that the battle wasn't about their words. It was about whether or not he let them take root. Still, the words hung there, an old and familiar presence. Because that was the great contradiction of this country. Wasn't it? It would send a man like him across the world to fight its wars. To kill and to bleed in its name. It would pin medals to his chest. Dress him in its uniform. And call him a hero. Until he sat down next to them. Then, suddenly, he was just another problem to be managed. Isaiah adjusted in his seat, stretching his legs slightly. A small thing. A movement that said, I am here, I am not leaving, and I am not going to shrink. And he could feel how much they hated it. The next assault came from another direction. The flight attendant returned, a new one this time. A man, lean, sharp-featured, the kind of polite that came with a rehearsed distance. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if this were a private conversation. Sir, he said, I wanted to check in and see if you needed anything. Isaiah looked at him, waited. A slight hesitation, just a flicker, and then, we want to ensure that all our passengers have a comfortable flight. I know there was some tension earlier, and we'd just like to smooth things over. There it was. Smooth things over. Not for Isaiah's sake, Not for the sake of fairness or dignity. No. This was about making sure the other passengers could enjoy their flight without the uncomfortable presence of a man who refused to know his place. Isaiah's gaze didn't waver. "I'm fine," he said. The flight attendant nodded slowly. "Of course," he said, but his eyes flicked toward Mrs. Whitmore's row for just a second. A second too long. A message passed between them. An unspoken understanding. She had complained again. Isaiah almost laughed. Because this was what they did. If they couldn't move you, they would erode you. They would make it exhausting. They would make you fight for the smallest things. Not by denying them outright, but by making you justify them. Again and again. Until the weight of it all made you consider giving up just to make it stop. But Isaiah Carter had carried heavier burdens than this. So he met the flight attendant's gaze and said, "I'll let you know if I need anything." And then he turned, dismissing the conversation entirely. The flight attendant lingered, just for a second longer than necessary, before walking away. Behind him, Mrs. Whitmore inhaled sharply. She was losing. And she knew it. The final test came with the meal service. The cart moved through first class. The scent of warmed bread and seasoned chicken filling the air. The woman across the aisle was served first. Then the man ahead of him. The flight attendant moved methodically. Pleasant smiles. Careful hands. And then, when she reached Isaiah, something changed. Her movements were just a little slower. Her expression is just a little tighter. The plate settled onto his tray just a little too hard. 100 little things that, alone, meant nothing. Together, they told him everything. And yet, Isaiah picked up his fork, cut into his chicken, and took a slow, deliberate bite. He chewed, he swallowed, he met the flight attendant's gaze, saw the flicker of frustration there, and then he did something he knew would unnerve them all. He smiled. Not big, not exaggerated, just enough to say, "You are not winning." And Mrs. Whitmore? She felt it. She shifted in her seat. She wasn't eating yet. She was too busy stewing. Because she had done everything she was supposed to do. She had complained. She whispered. She had signaled to the flight attendants, the other passengers, the very air itself, that this was wrong. That this was not how things were supposed to be. And yet, he was still here, eating his meal, resting in his seat, existing. And there was nothing she could do about it. Isaiah leaned back, savoring the moment. He had learned long ago that some fights could not be won with words or actions. Some fights were won by simply refusing to lose. And so, with a quiet satisfaction, he cut another piece of chicken and took another bite. The battle was not over. But this round belonged to him. Isaiah Carter had been here before. Not here, in this first-class seat, on this plane cutting through the clouds. No, the place he recognized was deeper than that, older than that. It was the place where a man, a certain kind of man, was expected to endure just a little more, absorb just a little more, carry just a little more of a weight that had never been his to bear. He could feel it coming. The silence had stretched too long now, thick with unspoken words, heavy with the kind of tension that no one could name, but everyone could feel. They weren't done with him yet. No, men like him were never just left alone. Isaiah lifted his glass of water, took a slow sip, let them wait. The plane hummed around him. Passengers shifting in their seats. Stewardesses moving between aisles with carefully composed expressions. A few rows ahead, an older man cleared his throat loudly. A warning, a signal, a reminder that this was not how things should be. Isaiah had disrupted something here. He had broken a rule, though no one would dare say what it was. A black man in first class was tolerable. But a black man who refused to shrink, that was unacceptable. And so they escalated. The flight attendant returned, the same one as before. The young man with the sharp features and the too-practiced smile. This time, his tone was different, more official, more firm. "Sir," he began, "I need to ask you something." Isaiah looked up, his expression unchanged. "Go ahead." The flight attendant hesitated, and there it was. That flicker of uncertainty. Because Isaiah wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't giving them the thing they needed. The excuse. The justification. The moment where he became the problem instead of the man enduring it. Some of our passengers, the flight attendant continued, glancing ever so briefly in Mrs. Whitmore's direction, have expressed concern that you may be making this flight tense. Isaiah almost laughed. Instead, he exhaled slowly. Tense. He had not spoken to Mrs. Whitmore. He had not raised his voice. He had not done anything. But that was never the point. Was it? His existence made them tense. His refusal to apologize for it made them afraid. And so now, after everything, after losing the Whisper campaign, after failing to have him removed, they had found their final weapon. The accusation of threat. It has always been the most powerful tool. Isaiah could see the script playing out before him. Clear as day. Step 1. Make him uncomfortable. Step 2. If he reacts, claim he is aggressive. Step 3. If he does not react, claim he is making others uncomfortable. Step 4. No matter what, ensure that he is to blame. And here they were. The trap was set. Now, he had to decide. The weight of the moment settled on his chest. An old and familiar pressure. He had fought for this country. He had bled for it. He had watched men die for it. Some who looked like him. Some who didn't. All of them swallowed by a war that had never cared about their color when it sent them to die. But had cared plenty when they came home. And yet, here he was. Still at war. Not with bullets, but with expectations. With the quiet, polite violence of people who would never call themselves racists. But would still rather not sit beside him. Isaiah inhaled, then exhaled. He turned his eyes up to the flight attendant and, in a voice so calm it was almost dangerous, asked, "What exactly have I done?" The young man hesitated. He had been expecting cooperation. Perhaps resistance. But not this. He blinked. Sir. As I said, there have been concerns. Quote. From whom? Isaiah interrupted. A long silence. The flight attendant's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He glanced back toward Mrs. Whitmore. But she did not meet his gaze. Because that was the other rule. You never had to say it out loud. You only had to suggest. You only had to imply. I see, Isaiah said, nodding slightly. Then he leaned forward. Tell me something, he said, keeping his voice level, measured. If I were a white man in this same seat, would we be having this conversation? The air changed. The flight attendant tensed. Someone 3 rows away shifted in their seat. Because now it was real. Now, it was out in the open. A wound pulled from beneath the skin and exposed to the light. The flight attendant did not have an answer. And Isaiah knew why. Because there was no answer that would not betray the truth. Slowly, deliberately, Isaiah leaned back in his seat. If the captain wants to speak to me, I'll be here, he said. If security is waiting for me when we land, I'll be here. He let the silence stretch. But until then, he lifted his glass of water again. Took another slow sip. I'll be right here. The flight attendant stood frozen for a moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Behind him, Mrs. Whitmore exhaled sharply, but it was not the exhale of victory. Isaiah could feel it now. The shift, the moment slipping through her fingers. Because she had done everything she could. She had tried every tool, pulled every string, and still, he was here, and she would have to sit with that. Isaiah closed his eyes. The plane hummed around him. Somewhere in the rows behind him, a conversation began again, voices rising, returning to the usual rhythm of flight. Because that's how it always was. People like Mrs. Whitmore, they had the luxury of moving on, of forgetting, of shifting back into their comfortable lives without carrying the weight of what had happened here. But Isaiah knew better. He had won this battle. But the war? The war would follow him home. Isaiah Carter was not a fool. He knew that winning, if this could even be called a victory, did not mean that the fight was over. It only meant that the battle had changed shape, slipped into another form. Racism, after all, was not something that simply ceased when it was challenged. It recoiled, it regrouped, and then it came at you again. So Isaiah knew, long before the flight attendant returned, that another shoe was waiting to drop. It happened just after the meal trays had been cleared. When the plane had settled into the kind of heavy, artificial stillness that came in the middle of a flight. Isaiah had felt the shift. The way people were trying to will the moment into the past. Pretending it had never happened. That was how it worked. Wasn't it? White discomfort was momentary. Black endurance was lifelong. Mrs. Whitmore had lost. But she was not beaten. He could sense it in the way she sat rigidly behind him. The way her hands folded too tightly in her lap. She would not let this go. Not because she had been wronged, but because she had not won. And when a woman like that refused to accept defeat, she found another way to fight. Isaiah heard her voice before he saw the flight attendant approaching. Yes. And I just don't feel safe. You understand? These days, you can't be too careful. Safe. That was the word now. That was the escalation. The flight attendant returned, this time with a different expression. He was no longer a man trying to smooth over a disagreement between passengers. Now, he was a man fulfilling a duty. He crouched slightly, lowering his voice as if that might soften the blow. Mr. Carter, he said, I need to speak with you privately. Isaiah set down his glass of water. Go ahead, he said. The flight attendant's lips pressed into a thin line. If we could step to the galley for a moment? Isaiah glanced around. The eyes of the cabin were on him now, though most of them pretended not to be. He could feel their presence, the weight of their attention. He smiled, but there was no humor in it. If you have something to say, he said, voice level, you can say it right here. The flight attendant hesitated. Then, leaning closer, he whispered, there's been a complaint. The passenger behind you has expressed concern about your behavior. Isaiah laughed softly. My behavior, he repeated. The flight attendant cleared his throat. She feels unsafe. The words hit like a hammer. Not because they were true. Of course they weren't. But because they were meant to be. Isaiah had not moved, had not raised his voice, had not threatened, had not cursed, had not done a single thing except refuse to give up his seat. And yet, here it was, the weapon of white womanhood. It had built cities, torn them down. It had justified lynchings. It had birthed laws designed to keep men like him in check. It had whispered into the ears of police officers and judges and politicians. Over and over again throughout history. And the result had always been the same. And now, it was here, in the first-class cabin of an airplane, rearing its head once more. Isaiah exhaled slowly. What exactly does she feel unsafe about? He asked. The flight attendant swallowed. She says you've been watching her. Isaiah stared at him. And there it was. The shift from discomfort to accusation. Because that was how this worked. If a black man could not be removed for sitting in his seat, then perhaps he could be removed for looking at a white woman the wrong way. There was a time, not long ago, not long enough at all, when that alone would have been enough to end him. Isaiah felt the weight of it, the deep, ancient sickness of it. His mind flickered, just for a second, to Emmett Till, to the stories his father had told him in hushed tones when he was a boy, to the warnings that had been passed down like heirlooms. He had done nothing, and yet, he had already been judged. The flight attendant was still waiting. Waiting for Isaiah to do something. To stand up. To defend himself. To react. But Isaiah Carter had lived long enough to know when the game was rigged. So he simply said, no. The flight attendant blinked. I sorry? No. Isaiah repeated. No. I will not move. No. I will not step into the galley to make this easier for you. No. I will not play along. His voice was even, but his body was taut with the exhaustion of having to be careful. Because that, too, was part of it, wasn't it? The expectation that a black man must always be careful. Careful with his words, with his movements, with his emotions. Careful, because his life depended on it. But Isaiah was tired. Tired in a way that no nap could fix. No polite exchange could soothe. Tired in the way that only a man who had fought for something that never fought for him could be. The flight attendant stood there for a moment longer. Then turned, perhaps sensing that pushing this any further would lead to more eyes. More questions. Mrs. Whitmore let out an audible huff behind him. And Isaiah Carter sat still in his seat, knowing that the real danger had only just begun. The lie had been spoken. And once spoken, a lie is like a match struck in a dry field. It does not simply vanish. It spreads. Isaiah Carter sat still in his seat, unmoved. But he knew. It was no longer just about Mrs. Whitmore's discomfort. It was about order. Their order. And order, in places like this, meant that a man like him was only allowed to exist as long as he did not make himself too visible. He had already broken that rule. By refusing to move. By refusing to shrink. By refusing to let them tell him who he was. And now? Now, they would make sure he understood. It began with silence. Not the comfortable kind. The sort that settled naturally between passengers lulled by the hum of the engines. No, this was the other kind. The silence of a room deciding who it belongs to. The man across the aisle, who had barely looked up from his newspaper earlier, suddenly seemed very interested in the flight attendant's movements. The woman 2 rows ahead, who had offered a polite nod when Isaiah first boarded, now stared fixedly out of the window, as if watching clouds was suddenly the most urgent thing in the world. And Mrs. Whitmore? She sat taller now. There was something about her posture. The way she folded her hands in her lap. The way her lips pressed together. That told him everything. She had won something. Not the battle over his seat. Not yet. But something deeper. Something more dangerous. She had managed to turn him into a problem. And in a place like this. At a time like this. Being the problem meant you were already halfway to losing. The flight attendant returned. Not the young one this time. A different man. Older. More experienced. The kind of man they sent in when things had the potential to get messy. But needed to stay clean. He approached with a practiced ease. But his eyes were cold. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I'm going to need you to come with me." Isaiah exhaled slowly. There it was. They weren't asking anymore. And they weren't giving him a choice. He could feel the whole cabin watching now. Waiting. Not necessarily wanting to see him dragged from his seat. No, that was too crass. Too obvious. But wanting it handled. Wanting things to return to normal. Wanting this to go away. Isaiah turned his gaze to the man standing over him. And he saw it. The same thing he had seen in Vietnam. The same thing he had seen in barbershops in the South. In department stores in the North. In offices. In courtrooms. In places where the rules had been written long before he ever arrived. The look of a man who didn't care about right or wrong. Only about obedience. Isaiah Carter had spent his life measuring the distance between his dignity and his survival. He had learned when to push. When to walk away. When to let a thing go. And when to stand his ground. He looked around the cabin now. At the faces of people who would never have to make that choice. Who would never have to decide if sitting in the seat they paid for was worth the risk of being seen as a threat. And he made his decision. "No," he said simply. The flight attendant blinked. "Excuse me?" "No," Isaiah repeated. "I will not move. I have done nothing wrong. I will not play along." The moment stretched. The air grew tighter. Somewhere, a throat cleared. A nervous rustle of fabric. The flight attendant's jaw tensed. "Mr. Carter, if you refuse to comply, I will have to involve the captain." Isaiah nodded. Then involve him. It was not a challenge. It was not even defiance. It was truth. And it was the last thing they had wanted to hear. Because now, they would have to say it out loud. They would have to admit that a black man sitting quietly in first class. A war veteran. A man who had fought for the very freedoms they claimed to cherish. Was enough of a problem to call in the authority of a captain. And Isaiah Carter knew one thing. They did not want to say it out loud. Because saying it out loud meant owning it. Saying it out loud meant breaking the illusion that this was ever about anything other than what it had always been about. For the first time since the plane left the ground, Mrs. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, she realized that she had pushed too far. Because suddenly, the battle wasn't between her and Isaiah anymore. It was between her and the lie she had created. She had played her hand. She had drawn the line. But now she had to reckon with the fact that Isaiah had refused to step over it. And that? That meant she was the one who looked unreasonable. Not him. Her. Isaiah could feel it. The shift in energy. The creeping uncertainty in the air. People who had been silently complicit now squirmed. Because suddenly, this wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. Suddenly, it was a scene. And the thing about white discomfort is that it does not like being forced into the light. The flight attendant hesitated. Mrs. Whitmore's jaw was tight now. But her eyes flicked toward the front of the plane, as if hoping someone would step in. Save her. Make this disappear. And Isaiah? Isaiah leaned back. Steady. Unmoved. Let them decide. Let them say it out loud. Let them explain to the entire cabin. Hell, to the entire world, why the only man who had done nothing wrong was the one being asked to move. The moment stretched. The tension reached its peak. And then, a single, tired voice from the front of the plane, belonging to an elderly white man who had been watching this unfold, cleared his throat. Leave the man alone, he muttered. Let's get where we're going. And just like that, it broke. The moment, the tension, the battle, because that was all it took. Wasn't it? For one white voice to turn the tide. The flight attendant hesitated. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. And behind Isaiah, Mrs. Whitmore said nothing. Nothing at all. Because she had lost. And there was nothing left to say. Isaiah Carter turned toward the window. The sky stretched endlessly ahead of them. And as the plane hummed on, he allowed himself to breathe. Isaiah Carter had spent his life waiting for a landing that never quite arrived. Men like him, black men who had fought for a country that never fought for them, had been promised many things. That their service would earn them respect. That their sacrifice would make them equals. That their endurance would eventually be rewarded with something softer. Something lighter. Something better. And yet, here he was, seated in first class. A war hero who had seen men bleed and die beside him. And still, he had spent an entire flight being asked to prove his right to be here. The final hour of the flight passed in a heavy, unnatural quiet. Not peace. Peace was earned, and this had not been earned. No, this was the kind of silence that followed an argument where nothing had been resolved. Where words had been spoken but no one had truly listened. Where an entire room of people had participated in something ugly, only to pretend later that they hadn't seen a thing. Mrs. Whitmore no longer muttered, no longer whispered, but that was not the same as regret. She sat behind him, stiff-backed, hands folded in her lap, her entire being radiating the quiet rage of a woman who had been denied her victory. But she would never admit to herself what she had been fighting for. That was the greatest illusion of all, wasn't it? That she was not a racist. That she was simply standing up for herself. That she had not tried to push him back. Down. Out. She would tell herself that she had merely wanted things to be right. And in the world as she had known it, right had always meant a man like Isaiah Carter knew his place. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent. We should be on the ground in about 20 minutes. The plane tilted slightly, sinking toward the earth. Isaiah exhaled. But the battle wasn't over. Because the battle was never over. As the plane touched down, he felt the weight of it all pressing against his ribs. The kind of exhaustion that did not come from one fight, but from a lifetime of them. Because this fight had not started here, in the sky. It had started generations before him. On roads where men were told to step aside when white men passed. At lunch counters where the right to sit down had been another war. In neighborhoods where crosses burned. And in schools where textbooks wrote men like him out of history. This was just a new version of an old battle. And Isaiah knew, as sure as he had ever known anything, that it would not end when his feet touched the ground. Because the landing never truly came. Not for men like him. The seatbelt sign flickered off. Passengers stood, stretching, retrieving their bags, returning to their small, comfortable worlds. And then, a hesitation. Mrs. Whitmore stood too, but this time, she did not rush past him. She lingered. He did not turn. He did not need to. He could feel her there, hovering, as if trying to decide whether to say something or let silence swallow this moment whole. Isaiah waited, and then, soft, almost brittle, Sergeant Carter. His name, his title, spoken. At last, Isaiah turned, slowly. She looked different now, not defeated, no, but unsettled. She held something in her hand. A card, a business card. She extended it toward him. A gesture, Not quite an apology, but not nothing, either. Isaiah looked at it, then looked at her. Then, without a word, he let the moment pass. He turned, walked forward, stepped off the plane and into the world waiting for him below. Because he had learned long ago. Some wars were not his to win. And some men, some women, would never understand that they had lost.